Shepherdstown, West Virginia is located in the eastern panhandle of the state, near the famous Civil War sites of Antietam and Harper's Ferry. Founded by Thomas Shepherd in 1734 and chartered by the Virginia Assembly in 1762, it is the oldest town in the state. Today, Shepherdstown is home to a division of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a bureau of the Department of Interior. That's where Q&A cameras went in late April to talk with historian Douglas Brinkley about his upcoming book on the influence of our 26th president on the history of the conservation movement. The book is titled The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America.
Doug Brinkley, why did you want to start our conversation about your book at this center?
Well, this is the National Conservation Training Center. This is where biologists get trained, that make sure that our rivers and that our marshlands are taken care of, that manage endangered species. It's the headquarters of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but conservationist leaders from all over the world come here for seminars and to learn proper methods and techniques. Here on the side, like walking past, are all of the pictures of caribou in Alaska. Roosevelt was very interested in all big game, including caribou. And what interests me as writing a book like The Wilderness Warrior is Roosevelt really is the father of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. If John Muir is known as the creator of the Sierra Club, it's Roosevelt that realized that the federal government has an obligation to save species of birds and animals, that to save plants and trees, and to be the president has an obligation to make sure that we put aside for generations unborn natural wonders like Roosevelt did, like the Grand Canyon or Mount Olympus or the Petrified Forest. And they turned this training center for conservation into a museum almost for Theodore Roosevelt.
When did you first get interested in Theodore Roosevelt?
I've loved him since childhood. I liked reading about him. I liked Edmund Morris's biographies and David McCullough's. But I really got interested in him in 1992 when I had a program, the Magic Bus. I'd bring students across the country, and I went to the Badlands of North Dakota. It's the western edge, and that's where TR spent his ranching days as a cowboy. It's where he did some of his hunting, but he wrote these incredible books, a book that I particularly like, for example, called The Wilderness Hunter. And many people have come in on the hunting part, but in between it was this incredibly informed writing about the biology, the ecosystem, as we call it today, of the Badlands. Roosevelt knew more about the Badlands than any person alive 100 years ago. And so I fell in love with that particular American landscape. And then I was teaching at Hofstra University, and with the late John Gable, who was a professor who died, unfortunately, of cancer, John and I co-hosted a Hofstra presidential conference. I was co-chair on Theodore Roosevelt. So I had papers coming in from all over. And I started realizing, and John Gable helped me realize this, that there had never been a book written on TR and conservation, on TR and the wilderness of any magnitude. There was a university press one of a little bit of note. So I had this great opening there, and I started realizing that between the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln, and World War I with Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt using the White House to promote conservation and nature, and what he'd call the strenuous life, to want to save birds, his involvement with the Audubon Society, and the eventual creation of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and our national monuments. It's changed America. I mean, if this summer anybody opens up an atlas, a Rand McNally atlas, there's America, and you see all that green. You're looking at Roosevelt reserves, Roosevelt monuments. He put aside almost 240 million acres of wild America. And so now, as people are talking about environmentalism and green movements, Roosevelt is becoming the key figure to understand, because he was the only politician of his day who had absorbed Darwin and who had understood biology and understood birds' migratory patterns and understood mating habits of deer and elk and antelope, and actually did something. He's a president who in his young days shot a buffalo, and then he's the president who created Wichita Mountains and Oklahoma Reserve for buffalo and one up in Montana.
One of the things you see throughout this center are stuffed animals.
Well, taxidermy was a big thing. Roosevelt was trained in the art of taxidermy. In fact, as a young boy, his teacher in New York was a man named John Bell, who had been Audubon's student. So there's a linkage between John James Audubon and Roosevelt. And young TR had asthma. He was very sickly. But from 8 years old onwards, he was obsessed with birds. And he created his own Roosevelt Museum, Brian. He had his father, Theodore Roosevelt's father, was a founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And young TR just became a bird lover. His first document we have of TR as a young boy is about birds. And the last article he wrote before his death at age 60 was about birds. And I'm not saying he just liked birds. He was one of the world's experts on coloration and variation, on inventorying what we have. And he created these bird reservations. 51 federal bird reservations that Roosevelt created are now the heart and soul of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And all the people watching this have heard of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, but they don't realize that it all began with these 51 bird reservations of Roosevelt, trying to save egrets and spoonbills and pelicans, etc., on both coasts.
Before we go any further, explain where this conservation training center is located.
We are in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, not too far from Washington, about 90 minutes. It's a beautiful campus here in West Virginia. It's here it's the archive where I did research, because they have the papers not just of early conservationists, but people like Rachel Carson in the 1960s who worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So for me, this place is an archival treasure trove. Now, in addition, I went to the places Roosevelt saved, so I would go to various bird places that he actually saved, and they have local archives, one in Michigan or one in Arizona. I even went to Puerto Rico recently to go to see the Yunque National Forest, which he saved for the National Forest Service, which is our only rainforest in our entire protection system in the United States, and it's home to a rare Puerto Rican parrot. And it's a spectacular park if you can go to Puerto Rico and see the rainforest there. But I would go to these places, meet the local superintendent or ranger or warden, what have you, and interview them, and also get local documentation too. But this is the nerve center for what I consider Roosevelt's grid of America.
We're standing in the Roosevelt room of the center, but you look up behind you and there's a photograph, large photograph above the fireplace. Who's in that photo?
That's Theodore Roosevelt with the great naturalist John Muir in 1903. Remember, Roosevelt becomes president in 1901 because McKinley is assassinated. TR gets sworn in Buffalo and says, I'm going to keep policies similar to McKinley. He doesn't. Immediately, only 2 months as president, TR starts this aggressive conservation program because he had created the first game. Boone and Crockett Club TR had created was the first wildlife protection for big game group. He was a member of the Audubon Society, and as governor of New York, TR had been considered a radical on preservation of natural resources. In 1903, TR gets on the train and goes to Yellowstone with John Burroughs. Then he goes to the Grand Canyon. Then he ends up in the redwoods of Northern California, and then goes to Yosemite. And here's the President of the United States with John Muir, and they camp out. They spend 3 days in the wild. They camp under these redwood trees, which Roosevelt thought were like, the redwoods were our great cathedrals. He would use religious imagery about redwoods. They slept in a snowstorm without a tent. And Roosevelt, with this bully enthusiasm, the greatest day I've ever spent in my life, freezing in a snowstorm with John Muir. And they would try to out-naturalist each other. Nobody knew birds like TR, but Muir was more of a botanist, so he would talk about the plants, and Roosevelt was out playing him on birds. But they had a kind of a friendly competition. Roosevelt thought Muir was one of our great figures. They had some differences. TR was a hunter conservationist. Muir thought that only in extreme cases of hunger should you shoot an animal. Roosevelt believed that was nonsense, that you had to kind of constantly hunt, that hunters were the great conservationists. At one moment by a campfire, Muir says to Roosevelt, when are you going to give up that boyish hunting thing of yours? And TR uncharacteristically said, I know I need to. I should. Of course he didn't.